Very well. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for staying until the very end. I'm not sure if there's some cocktail upstairs. I hope so, to keep you hooked. My name is Hugo, and we are here today to discuss yet again regulatory risks and legal risks and regulatory resilience. So yeah, quite boring topic. Let's try to make it a little bit more interesting. I'm going to try to poke some holes in our audiences, especially after the very nice talk from Pinto, which is quite a rebellious project, as you have heard, especially when we are comparing it with some of the other stablecoin projects that presented over the past few days. So yeah, without further ado, let me just try to get a rain check on what's your perspective on regulation. So today we had a debate this morning about MiCA and Genius, and we have some other panels chatting a little bit about these topics. Do not go overboard about them. We here thinks that the MiCA regulation here in Europe is good. 2 folks. 3? No, just 2. The other person is just scratching its head. Yeah, that's good. Okay, nice. And we here thinks that the Genius stablecoin regulation in America is good. Okay, some maybe 3 times more, and so that's interesting to see. I think that's pretty much an accurate assessment of what I've been checking in some other conferences in the overall industry. So let's go deep a little bit about that, and starting with Chris, and given your extensive experience at all levels of government, I was curious to get some more insights, specifically on the Genius stablecoin regulation, and how is that threatening what was once perceived as the kingdom of Europe on stablecoin regulation, which is clearly not the case. But also, there has been some interesting criticism of Genius, especially by David Sachs, but not only. So curious to dive a little bit more into that.
Yeah, thanks. Chris from Rain. We're a credit card issuers backed by stablecoins. So if you've seen any of the stablecoin-backed credit cards in the market, we are the kind of the stack that runs that. Just for reference, I used to work in government in the U.S., both on Capitol Hill and the White House. For Genius, I mean, I think it's the way you phrased it, I think is accurate. I said, you asked, is it good? I think it's good. It's not great. I think there's a lot of issues you could take with it. But let's be honest, there's a very, very slim margin. So politically speaking, you can't get everything you want. I know people, including CryptoZar Sachs, has highlighted some of the issues around yield. I actually think that's not a huge concern because at least, as the current version of it expresses, there's no prohibition on other people getting yield from the stablecoin. It's just the issuer themselves. So I don't think there's going to be a problem with like the end customer getting yield. I think there's some other issues in it that have kind of fallen under the radar a bit. For example, you still have to register and kind of get regulated by 50 states if you're going to use these chartered stablecoins, which is a problem, especially when compared to the EU, where you have kind of the passporting regime. So that's not great when you have 50 states that have all different kind of licensing regimes for money transmission. I also think it's probably problematic when you've already seen a bunch of those states try and pick up the mantle from Secretary Gensler or Chairman Gensler and kind of step into the breach there. So there's obviously a bunch of state regulators that are opposed to crypto still. So that leaves us exposed. But with that said, I think it's it's pretty solid. It's a good start, and I do think this has been stated a number of times by Secretary Besson and the president, like that the goal of stablecoins, at least from the U.S. perspective, is continue U.S. dollar dominance, and it's going to help with that. Obviously, in opposition to what the EU is trying to do in that regard. So I'll leave it there and let others chime in.
Yeah, definitely. Going into Michael, but just touching on this last point of yours. Not sure if anyone in the room heard or saw what Christine Lagarde said last week about stablecoins. That's shameful. Because she said that the EU MEPs, the EU lawmakers, need to speed up the process to approve her very dear digital euro project, CBDC, to fight the hegemony of US stablecoins. Do you think the digital euro is the right tool to fight the hegemony of US stablecoins or US denominated stablecoins? Maybe let's discuss this in a short moment. I don't think so. But Michael, going back to you, and especially regarding this aspect that Chris was mentioning, that regulation or this regulation is good but not great, and given the fact that most crypto regulations have been just purely transposed from TradFi regulations, even MiCA being a perfect example of that from MiFID. Not sure about America, but you can expand on that. But so given that knee-jerk reaction, like, what's your perspective on the state of crypto regulation, and how can crypto projects become more resilient, either by trying to fight the regulation themselves, a little bit like Pinto does, or tries to do, as opposed to any other solutions you may think of, given your very nice experience at the Coin Center?
Thank you. And just briefly in the background, like I've been doing crypto stuff for 10 years, recently security, but moonlighting as a technical person in policy conversations, which has mainly been working with Coin Center as a fellow, but representing myself and my opinions. Coin Center's made their point clear on like where they see like legislative focus should be, which is actually more on the Clarity Act, which is just an extension of the work that they've been doing for almost 10 years in Congress now, which is to get like a lot of housekeeping done on like providing regulatory certainty to developers building in the space to resolve questions like Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet, which is where does liability for developers lie? And that is a very blurry, very dangerous line that has been drawn, such as by the Biden administration's Department of Justice. So that's what I'm more excited about. But the fact that Genius has been passed, the fact that a piece of crypto legislation has been passed that is at least intended to be positive and consider the industry important is an incredible milestone, because that has been something that has been worked on forever. Up till this point, it has been purely on the defense of trying to keep harmful legislation from being passed that is kind of almost nefariously like trying to target the crypto industry. So that's a really good stepping stone. That being said, yeah, there are challenges, I think, in trying, and what we've seen so far, which has been most regulators coming from okay, let's try to assume that people can do AML KYC as they normally do in traditional finance. And there were some talks earlier today that highlighted this, but like, you know, the little known secret is that there's a lot of money spent in compliance in traditional finance, and its effectiveness is questionable, to say the least. And actually stopping bad actors, it's more just putting it means only sophisticated bad actors usually can get away with money laundering, but they very much still do, and they use traditional finance to do so. So the real question is, like, how do we then approach it in crypto? And from a security perspective, there has been a lot of like both hacks, but then outright fraud that Blockaid has been almost built entirely from the ground up to fight, that we are seeing being perpetuated. We're seeing billions flowing into North Korea's nuclear program and funding the development of weapons that could harm not just Americans, but anyone across the globe. And that needs to be addressed. Like, crypto can't have a silent answer or a freedom permissive answer. You cannot support freedom in crypto if it means you give freedom to totalitarian regimes to oppress their people and fund their efforts further. So with that potentially controversial stake put out there, I think what we need to see is regulations written to say, okay, if you are a custodial actor or you're an actor that's trying to build technology, including stablecoins, you need to give a pathway to reliably fight against bad actors that are going to potentially steal funds, launder money, et cetera. But you need to create an open space where you're not mandating they use traditional methods. I think using zero-knowledge technology, using better digital identity standards, there is a path where you can create compliant stablecoins. Or at least ones that are able to address AML KYC challenges without reverting to old TradFi methods or limiting innovation. And there's no clear answer to this. It's simply that regulations need to be written where regulators are aware there are potentially these better solutions out there that can be both more permissive and more open to users being able to like have direct custody of funds and not being limited, but still being able to like have an answer to how to fight bad actors. And that's so there's not a clear answer there. I think we're going to see more solutions being built over time that are going to better address that. And the way regulations need to be written is just in such a way that, like, hey, there's a bit more freedom to pursue options that will provide AML KYC, and that there's a carve out for users, for self-custodial users, where there's no third party directly involved, can still act mostly freely. Like, once you start to operate something close to a business, which frankly many stablecoin projects will be, except for maybe the purest of them. There has to be someone like backing those assets. There has to be developers building it and getting funded. Like, you have to. The clear future is there will be more regulatory expectations for them, if there weren't already some. We would just hope that they have the ability to pursue better options in the future.
Definitely. So if you are in the US, you should consider donating to the Coin Center. If you are in Europe, you should consider donating to UCI, the European Crypto Initiative. And yeah, Pelle, on to you. And I think this will be a nice transition because at Notabene you have done a lot of work in regard to driving forward crypto compliance. But at the same time, I see you as a crypto OG, which also shares a lot like the traditional or typical ethos of crypto values. And how do you balance those out? And how do you see these difficult equilibrium in between innovation and safety going forward?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just, well, for context, probably not many people outside of CeFi know what we do, but we've essentially built Swift for crypto over the last 5 years, and we are now starting to reach some quite significant transaction volumes where we're not quite at Swift level, but we are, you know, edging up there at the moment. And most of the CeFi industry is using us right now to process transactions in a compliant way to solve a lot of the issues that you talked about with KYC. Like ultimately, stablecoin suppliers or issuers should not have to do KYC, for example. That's what a financial institution does, and they privately implement payment standards and payment compliance to be able to solve those things. But one of the big issues that I see in this industry, because I've been involved since the old cypherpunk days. I'm an old anarcho crypto kind of guy, and now I'm invited to FATF meetings and these kinds of things, right? Which is, you know, 10 years ago I was giving talks against FATF, but I've come to the conclusion that that as an industry we've kind of lost track about what we were actually for. When I started getting into Bitcoin in 2010, you know, I was out there at meetups talking about, you know, we're going to replace Visa and we're going to replace Swift. We're going to do all of these kind of things. But we've been so enamored with this massive decentralization theater, I have to say, that we've actually set our industry back. Also, constant fear of regulation rather than, you know, everyone's trying to figure out how do I arbitrage my way around regulation and therefore lying to themselves and everyone else about what they do, right? And I think that's actually setting the industry back. It's not setting, you know, people who are maybe trying to push their token or something back temporarily, but ultimately, if our goal is to get the $190 trillion of payments that are happening right now every year in cross-border payment on stablecoins, we can't keep playing this theater, playing these kind of games with each other and our users, because you know what? We're not going to get the users. We can talk about bad UX, all of these kind of things, but we're not going to have a functioning system. And to get that functioning system, unfortunately, we need the regulators to be along with it. We need financial institutions to be along with it. And we need a ton of innovation still, of course. And that's where we have to kind of balance all of these things.
Yeah, right. I think we'll come back to this topic in a moment. But coming down to you, Svetlin, our European man at the other end of the panel, curious on your perspective on all these, but specifically on MiCA and on what we've heard on some other panels. We have, I think it was, like the guy from Anchorage, not Bruno, but starts with a B, I believe, was also saying, yeah, MiCA effectively killed the possibility for stablecoins to scale in Europe, in addition to other issues. And 3-4 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago, at crypto conferences like these, everyone was praising MiCA as the savior of the crypto industry in Europe. And that has clearly been not the case, especially now with the threat of more sophisticated regulation coming in from America. So how do you see all these? And then how do you tie these up specifically to the risks that stablecoin issuers face? How can they innovate here if they want to conquer the global arena, or if they want to be building out of Europe?
Thank you. To give a bit more context, in the course of our risk evaluations at LlamaRisk, we have observed many different legal regimes, not only the praised MiCA but also other legal frameworks across different countries that are attempting to capture, to different extent, stablecoin regulations. I have cited some in the course of our discussion, but specifically on the point of MiCA, my view is that it was long-awaited law that was expected to bring sufficient transparency and ease the operations of different players within the crypto space. However, the result is that this regulation, as much as serving the purpose for customer protection, it significantly hampers the innovation. Of course, this is my personal view. Practically, it is impossible to start operating compliantly if you're not well-funded and sized firm as of a current date. And this, as we have seen, prevents newcomers from entering the Euro crypto stage. We cannot state for sure what is the number of businesses that have already left Europe, but a quick check at MiCA Interim Register will show that currently we have a number of CASP authorizations, around 10 EMT, electronic money token issuances allowed, and 0 asset reference tokens issuances approved. And without serving as any sort of advisor or legal counsel of Ethina, basically BaFin killed their effort to become compliant within the European boundaries. So maybe the case is that European authorities, driven by the desire to protect the European customer base, effectively lost the pace with which they pushed very harsh restrictions.
Yeah, definitely. Like, MiCA succeeded at its main goal, which was to kill Facebook's Libra. It was created for that, and it succeeded. But now it's killing everything else. Like Ethina, BaFin, as you said, literally fucked them. And they were trying to get the license in Portugal, but the Portuguese government fell. And so we are one of the few countries in Europe which doesn't have an operational regime for MiCA licenses. Yet, the government has been elected recently, and we have heard good news. It's nearly there. But after BaFin, what can the Portuguese regulator do for that? Let's see, but not easy, because Ethina also has a big crowd building out of Portugal. But yeah, you touched on this point about like regulation, and I was thinking about like the contrast between regulation and self-regulation, and how regulators typically react in a knee-jerk fashion, typically to acts or to big threats like Libra, but also at the time of Luna's crash, like Lagarde and the rest of the EU folks were like, oh, we need to start thinking about MiCA too. Fortunately, that idea seems to have been killed recently, but it's still a threat that looms over the old continent. So the question is it possible for the industry to self-regulate in a way that's sufficient for regulators not to go after them, or will banks always be lobbying on the back, on the sides, to push more regulation that keeps stablecoins uninteresting for consumers, so that consumers stay more like within the realms of banks? Mike?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. I appreciate that question, because I've heard that in other contexts. There was some conversations I had with cybersecurity professionals last week, and it was the same topic, but on more of the cybersecurity side. But it was like, can we get like good enough self-regulation? Because when you look at other practices, like like the accounting industry, the legal profession, usually on the services side, but still, it was like there's usually a self-regulatory body that there's no government mandate, But government regulators have, in effect, looked to this and said, this seems like a good regulatory body. This is not an industry we need to wade into. I think you touched on one challenge, which is like you do have existing players in the space that prefer regulation because it's a space in which they have an advantage, such as banks, traditional institutions. So you have that challenge, but you also have the challenges within the industry. Who is self-policing and saying that is too risky? Don't do that. And in stablecoin and crypto in general, it's usually like the degens are a large part of the market, and the degens will want and care about pushing the boundaries far further than is reasonable for the average consumer. And it's very difficult to avoid massive risk there. So the real question is like, okay, so who are the players in the industry that can, to some extent, be big enough to push stablecoins in the right direction and to point out the good acts versus bad? One, you obviously need to kind of like at least have some set of best practices and standards and things you just don't do. You don't do what Luna did and basically have zero backing behind your stablecoin and hide it behind these gobbledygook around some Bitcoin and algorithmic whatever. And I think in generic stablecoins, that's pretty well established, like what is at least a general good practice, and there's some transparency inherent in the chain, but there needs to be more disclosures on what happens off chain. But at the end of the day, like who's the ammunition to actually tell stablecoin issues, you do this or you don't survive, or rather you are not going to be a significant enough industry to be a threat. And that would be like the people that list them, like both the exchanges, like which exchanges are going to use which stablecoins, and even some of the DeFi platforms themselves. I know, like I've been on stage at this conference in the past, kind of representing Compound, and we had we had to replace what was a very loose listing process of, well, people like the stablecoin, so we're going to vote for it and list it, and then you learn issues down the line. We had that with TrueUSD and some technical issues they had in their implementation. So we had a very rigorous listing process that was both from a security perspective and a risk management perspective. And if you could get like more protocols across the line to say, we're all going to say we're not going to list stablecoins that have these inherent risks, I think that would go a long way. But I think what is needed is a single entity, a self-regulatory authority that is actually setting those rules and the regulator can talk to and understand how the industry self-regulates, as opposed to this happening kind of sporadically in different layers. I think there needs to be some sort of entity that everyone respects.
Yeah, it can be a consortium. Now, we have some opinions over here.
I would just say, like, I think that's a great idea. I'm all for it. I think the difference between lawyers and accountants and cybersecurity professionals and crypto is those people like to follow rules, and whereas everyone in crypto is inherently like anti-authoritarian, screw you, you can't tell me what to do. And so the idea that like a bunch of companies are going to come together and agree on something and someone's not going to try and like hard fork it and make, whatever the protocol is that does the exact opposite of that. I just think it's unlikely to happen. I think it would be great. It's certainly preferable than like a bunch of politicians who don't really understand the technology trying to implement and regulate in the space.
I wish I could disagree with you.
Yeah, but I just don't think it's going to happen.
Well, cybersecurity folks like to break the rules. So.
But I mean, I also don't think we need to regulate and stop all the different innovation happening out there, or even though there's a lot of what I consider bad shit happening out there in the degen community. But first of all, I think there's one thing that you said that I actually disagree with. I always used to believe it, that the regulators are here to protect the banks. And I actually do not think that's the case. That's not what I see.
I didn't say they are here to protect the banks. I said the lobbies, the banking lobbies.
But I actually also don't think that the banks are out to stop. There are a lot of things that they're nervous about. But one thing that a lot of people coming from crypto don't understand, like everyone likes to say, oh, banks, they don't get it. It's so old-fashioned. Why it's so slow? People that work in banking know how shitty banking is. They know how bad it is. Like they know. Like I spent, 20 years or something working on a system to reconcile SWIFT within a major European bank. And you wouldn't believe the amount of money they did not know, because the internal systems sucked so bad between SWIFT and trade. They were losing like something like 25, 30 million euros. I mean, it was before euros, pounds, I think it was actually back then, a day, because of all of this bad stuff. Bankers hate the thing that they had to. There's things that they have to deal with. There are things that are very difficult because of regulation, that they can't innovate as much as they want to, because they can't even go in and like patch their goddamn core banking system without getting the regulator's approval on it and stuff like that, right? So they're actually very, very keen to move forward, and they're looking at things like stablecoins. And when I say they, a subgroup probably. I'm not going to say all bankers for sure, but there is this idea within crypto that bankers are trying to stop us. They're trying to talk with the regulators, and maybe there's some other, but in reality, most of them actually, they know how broken their systems are, and they actually would be the primary beneficiaries of public blockchains and stablecoins and DeFi, all of these different kind of things. There's like just massive offices of back offices. They're processing all kinds of stuff that no one in crypto has any clue about. And they would love to get rid of all of that, right? But then the other part on the self-regulation, there's a ton of examples in TradFi about self-regulation. So for example, there's Swift. Swift, for example, is a consortia for payments. Now, it's going to be very difficult to get every single crypto company together in the world, particularly who are competing with each other, and create a competitor to Swift. And I don't actually think we want that either necessarily. But global regulators, they'll say, well, we can recommend Swift because, and Swift have their processes, and now, they spent the last 5 years getting upset at crypto because crypto isn't implementing proper payment rules, which is like where companies like us come in and fix that part of it. But now they're actually really upset at Swift and the banks and the core banking and all of these kind of things. And very few people in crypto has actually seen the latest updates that are massive opportunity for crypto and for stablecoins, because Swift, the overall, like FATF, the global regulators are saying, you guys fucked up in banking. You guys fucked up with Swift. There's all of this innovation that's happened on top of traditional payments to make things work. Everything like, actually, you guys, for example, you guys are a great way of one of these like solutions that makes Visa card issuance work in a great way. But it introduces on both sides, like there's not a lot of transparency. Like basically traditional payments is broken because there are like 20 different intermediaries. No one has any clue what's happening. There's so much risk. There's so much fraud. It's very expensive because of all of that. Crypto, we have the opportunity to actually do something a lot better. And this is a massive opportunity for us to work together. But I don't think we need an organization. I think we just need open protocols to talk about this.
To your point, correct me if I'm wrong, but Switzerland has a pretty decent self-regulatory organization that oversees VASPs. I'm not pretty sure how this will evolve around MiCA, even though the regulation doesn't have direct implications in Switzerland. What I could foresee is an analogy of European Union at 2 speed that was promoted by Macron a few years ago. In my view, the interest spread between centralized players, centralized exchanges, centralized businesses, and the one that is driven by DEXs and other DeFi participants is getting more and more diverse. So such consortium or any other type of self-regulatory organization may be composed by representatives of the 2 different worlds we are living now.
US, I'm not an expert in this, but I believe US, there's a long history of self-regulatory organizations, and particularly in different trading ecosystems, right?
Definitely, but on this point, like, it's all about this like regulatory bloat that the banking industry got affected by, especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But now crypto is suffering from it, whereas from a technology perspective, we will not need to, because we can build any kind of compliance in the technology. The fact that blockchains are reasonably transparent and composable, it just creates all this possibility for you to like diminish the need for the burden and the cost of compliance. But that's already being built by some protocols, and some stablecoins are kind of focused on that. But then we are not seeing the regulatory response on the other side, as in the regulators are still focused on the same lens they have to approach the banking industry. Maybe because they do not know better, although I've known some instances of the banking industry, not necessarily the CEOs, but their lawyers meddling directly against crypto. But of course, it's not a complot or a conspiracy. It happens just because of the incentives they have. But maybe it's also the problem of the regulators that no matter how well educated they may be, they still have just their lenses.
Can I intercept just a sec? That absolutely happens. I also just want to say it also very much happens in our industry that CEOs of very, very large crypto exchanges go in and meddle and stop processes that could actually make it easier for the rest of the industry. And for example, such a large exchange, and they're meddling in the European, like in the rollout of the TFR in the EU, is why you kept seeing those headlines that self-hosted wallets are going to be banned. It was because of a particular meddling CEO of a major exchange that I will not name that did.
They have their interests. Like even within crypto, there are all these realms, and there's this fight between the open systems and the closed systems, which is also an area of interest of yours, and very much aligned with this topic, because based on your previous work as well, you believe that open systems promote better innovation and better outcomes for the users and for society at large. Yet, capitalism and just people overall are typically incentivized to build closed systems so that they can extract whatever they want. But how can this change in the context of crypto? Like we have been for more than a decade trying to build open systems. We can argue that Ethereum is a functional one, but still there's so much chaos and so much infighting within. What's your perspective on these in the context of the regulation topic?
Like our approach to it is that we are, as I mentioned, we're building Swift for crypto, and we don't actually, when we say that, it's functionally Swift for crypto, and we are selling software to companies, but we actually don't want to ever be a gatekeeper or anything. We really, really believe in the open loop network that crypto is, and there are ways that you can do this in a very easy way. Well, maybe not easy way, but we are publishing open technical standards now. There's a public domain standard that we hope we can believe we can get, for example, FATF and banks, etc., to support, but not. They're actually the least interesting one. I want the crypto industry to support them and understand that they're public domain. There's no central gatekeepers in it. So we have TAP, which is a new protocol, the Transaction Authorization Protocol. tap.rsvp is the domain, where we're trying to do this and essentially build the technical standards to build Swift-like layers to create better, safer applications for real-world applications, particularly on top of stablecoins, but not just for stablecoin purposes. But it has to be done in a way that's open, and the interesting thing is it's actually a lot of large players again in crypto who's trying to close things down. Like I feel like there are a lot of the companies in the last 10 years who grew because of the first regulation. Like US in 2013 came out with the first practical crypto regulation, and out of that came some of these large players. And they're now kind of in this world, they're making so much money that they're essentially creating AOLs versions of crypto. And I personally, as someone who's a big believer in the openness of crypto, I think this is horrific, and it's also going to fail because AOL failed these closed networks. It goes closed and it goes open, and they're going to fail pushing this part of it. And DeFi and all of these aspects are part of keeping everything open. But even within these public ecosystems, like these DeFi ecosystems, we also run the risk of turning things closed. So yeah, my view.
Michael, Chris, Svetlin, thoughts on this?
I think the brief thing I'll mention is I think the trick is going to be saying, okay, who's ultimately a regulated entity and who's not, or who shouldn't be. And I think my biggest gripe legally, and it's something that Coin Center has also talked a lot about, is just how third-party doctrine has affected the way that surveillance and financial regulation is done in the United States, which has been this concept that like, well, okay, if you are interacting directly with some other person, then the government has no business regulating that for the most part, even if it's commerce. But once you introduce third parties, which has traditionally been banks, but has also even extended to technology providers, the government does have the ability to come in and say, we'd like to look at those records, and there can be legislation such as BSA that mandates it. There can even be closed door agreements between companies and the government to simply do passive surveillance, and that's to me the biggest concern in the fact that that's allowed a lot of regulation to sneak in cases where it wasn't maybe initially intended to that extent. And I think what's really important in crypto is, first of all, we do have fairly public systems today, but the hope for some is that eventually privacy is introduced as being more common for things in crypto and stablecoin, and that in general, like the ability to transact directly is never like compromised, and that just because you've built software that helps someone transact permissionlessly between two parties, that doesn't imply any sort of third-party doctrine that allows government to become involved. And granted, this is a doctrine specific to the United States and our legal system, but I would hope kind of could grow and be applied to other jurisdictions. And the most important thing is just to make it very clear when is there actually a third party involved and what sort of regulation did that imply? Even if there's a third party involved, there can be better ways to regulate than we have in the past, or the way we at least tried to be compliant with regulation. But yeah, it's like, for example, I would say Uniswap. Uniswap is an incredibly immutable protocol, allows anyone to go out there and issue a token for anyone to then be a liquidity provider to trade that token. It does introduce risks. You do have, for example, like rug pulls that can very quickly run and operate on Uniswap with no real restriction. But you can introduce some layers. You can say if you operate a Uniswap front end that people are trading through, you should at least do some due diligence, provide risks to users. We've worked with the Uniswap team to help them detect rug pulls and then signal that to the users. But if users want to bypass that and trade it anyway, they can. But they at least there's some consumer protection in the sense that they're getting risks surfaced to them. So that's just like one example, but there are ways we can add layers and do the sort of compliance and regulation that would be important for consumer protection and mass adoption, but without making it so that like at the end of the day, we treat like an AMM the same way we treat a stockbroker or other things. So at the end of the day, like making a very clear line, when is something like decentralized not for the sake of avoiding regulation, but because that's just the best way to have implemented it and to let people transact directly. And stablecoins are going to be a weird one because, issuers, yeah, we should probably regulate them, but a person paying for their Starbucks coffee, yeah, that should be considered a cash transaction where no third party exists, has occurred, and how you still like get the regulation and compliance that regulators are used to. It's going to be challenging, but it'll be new, and hopefully it'll be better at the end of it.
And
I would just agree on the BSA front. I mean, I think that the reality is that the BSA, which is the kind of overarching compliance regime for the U.S., I mean, I think there's a serious constitutional challenge coming to it in the next couple of years. The underpinnings in U.S. law have been slowly whittled away, and so that will have downstream effects, not just in the U.S. for crypto, but also I think in the EU, because let's be honest, like FATF and a lot of that, they come from the BSA. And then getting back to your point about regulatory capture, I mean, that is absolutely the case. There's emphatically large crypto players who are trying to cement their lead through either the Clarity Act or the Genius Act. I think getting back to the DeFi point, I think the good thing about both of those is at least they are like hands off for the most part about DeFi. And so the regulatory capture has not been extended to that. It's just kind of in the bigger players for centralized crypto regimes.
particularly in Europe, it's carved out from the current version of MiCA. We all hope that we will remain with MiCA v1 only, but there will be a report expected in maybe late 26 or to early 27 that should examine the necessity of further regulation of DeFi. What we have now is most of the projects relying on this exemption under recital 22 that can be broadly interpreted that MiCA is not intended to capture protocols that are sufficiently decentralized. How this sufficient decentralization shall be measured, what methodology shall be used. Neither the European lawmakers are yet clear on that, nor the national competent authorities developed any practical frameworks. I can relate the audience to the report of the Danish Financial Services Authority that introduced a good concept of assessing the decentralization of a protocol. It was conservative enough, and my expectation is that on a supranational level, such approach to be adopted. For the time being, most of the policymakers rely on the very broad definition given by our friends from FATF. That if you interpret in detail, you end up with the resolution that basically the core team has sufficient control over the protocol, and basically these regulatory hooks can be imposed on them. My call to action here is to be more creative with these interpretations and just devote more time and resources to reliable legal engineering, because if you just blindly follow the 3 lines provisions in the guidance coming from international body, you may end up with a lot of difficult legal pathway.
Definitely. Very well. We're about to wrap up. Your 30 seconds recommendations for the builders out there on how to build something that's more regulatory resilient. Of course, number 1, get out of Europe. But in addition to that,
I mean, I would just say, I think, Clarity Act or no Clarity Act, at least in the US, it's not that important for the next 3 years, because we've got leaders at the SEC, CFTC, OCC, who are like generally pro crypto. And so at least through like 2028, 2029, there's going to be reasonable regulations put in place that theoretically the next administration could repeal. But so for the time being, like the Clarity Act, I think people are focusing on it a lot. I'm very pessimistic that it will actually pass, but I don't think that's actually the be all end all for regulation in the US.
Don't forget my lawsuit.
can you repeat, sorry?
Oh, sorry. I was going to say I'm suing the DOJ over basically what the Clarity Act hopefully clarifies. So that's not the only dog in the race, although, the jury's out on that, literally. I would say the call to action is I would build, if you're building something that's going to be long-term, definitely don't worry as much about regulatory arbitrage in terms of the design. We've seen DAOs become almost more of a mess for protocols and really hamper their ability to innovate because they were designed with regulatory arbitrage more in mind than actual efficient governance. But I do think there's a lot of value in building a system that's going to govern your protocol independently of any one core team. I think there are security councils and others that you introduce in ways that, in an area where usually you design a protocol that by design, it shouldn't touch user funds directly, but there's a security council that could do an upgrade. There are bridge operators that could potentially freeze funds. These things will exist, and you have to kind of build knowing that they exist and put good guardrails in place where the right decisions will be made for users in the end. And when those decisions have to be made, they're made as efficiently and effectively as possible, to the point where, I think there are cases you could point to in crypto where the ways that they're operating was actually better for consumer protection than the way it might operate in traditional finance. And I think just build more examples of that so that regulators don't have bad cases to point to when they do want to find excuses to regulate poorly.
Well, don't leave Europe if you want to target a particular customer base within the block. But be sure that you can raise enough funds to fund your operations. As for builders of decentralized protocols, be aware of the forthcoming guidances and these reports that will shape the future. I'm not certain whether it will be regulation or high-level regulation or some secondary level of legislative improvements, but in the coming years, at least, we may expect more specific and more comprehensive observations of these decentralized operations. So be aware of legislative changes.
Yeah, and then finally for me, yeah, please do stay in Europe. Europe is pretty cool. I've lived both. I've lived all over the world. Europe is awesome. And don't be scared of regulation. I think if you're trying to do something real, something good, and not just figure out the next way to generate a little bit of yield or whatever, do something real, something that actually solves a real problem, and do it in a way where you actually focus on the safety of the users of whatever you're doing. I think you're going to do okay. It's the people who are having problems are the people who really don't care about their users and who are just trying to do regulatory arbitrage and pumping their goddamn token, right? Stop all of that. Build something real, something useful, and I really don't think you're going to have a massive issue in Europe or anywhere else with regulation. It's when you're doing all of that stupid shit, yeah, you will have issues anywhere in the world.
Yeah. As someone said earlier, stablecoins in Europe aren't as popular because our payment systems is actually quite decent as compared to the rest of the world. So maybe, yeah, stay in Europe, but don't build stablecoins. Go and build out some cool shit that solves real problems. But let the stablecoin fad pass.
There are tons of real problems we can solve.
Yeah, and stablecoins just a fad, boring. Stablecoins, like 3 years ago, wanted to work in stablecoins. Now it's kind of next big thing. Why?
Build the digital euro, yay.
Oh my God, we forgot about that, but the time is over. Thank God for Lagarde. We are not going to criticize her on stage, but I hope we go all outside and do some graffitis against Lagarde and the European Central Bank. Thank you, everyone, and on to the hosts.